Rothschild family, like Jacob Rothschild here. Why do these big banksters like the Rothschilds, why do they create media? Because by creating media, they control public opinion. By controlling what people know and what they think about anything, you're controlling them. You can deceive them. That's the problem. And it just so happens that these two men own the oil in the Golan Heights in Israel, in occupied Syria. And they also, as I said, the Rothschilds own the oil of northern Iraq. So they always get in, when these wars happen, they always get in and get the juiciest bits, the strategic assets, as they did in Yugoslavia as well. And here I'm just showing that in their company that owns the oil on the occupied Golan Heights, they also have this fella, Dick Cheney, and their Israeli partner is this guy down here, Efi Aitam, a religious rabbi, who says that we will have to kill them all, referring to the Arabs. Now, a little history about Israel before we get into the rest of it. Israel is a Zionist state, and as a Zionist state, it was created primarily by Britain and the Zionists. And the birth certificate for the state of Israel is this document here. It's a personal letter to Lord Rothschild. It's called the Balfour Declaration. It was written by Lord Balfour, the Minister of Defense, Secretary of Defense, Foreign Secretary for Britain, in 1917, 100 years ago. And he promised to Lord Rothschild the British support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. This was the beginning of Israel. And George Bush, just after 9/11, he came back from Camp David, and he said, this crusade, this war on terrorism is going to take a while. Now, you have to ask, why would it take a while to bring to justice a small gang of Islamic terrorists in Afghanistan? It makes no sense. They were preparing the American public for a long, drawn-out war across the whole world, which was the plan. And on September 20th, Bush declared war on terror, saying you're either with us or you're against us. Now, the cost of the war on terror is astronomical. It's costing us the wars alone are costing us $8.5 million an hour, and Homeland Security is costing us $6 million an hour, for a total of already $2.5 trillion having been spent. And that money is all borrowed money. Which means, if this debt is not repudiated, means that this debt will be burdening our children and grandchildren and their children. So the war on terror, the fraudulent war on terror, is based on the official myth of 9/11. To give you an idea of how much money is being spent, we are spending $400 million per year per victim of terrorism, per U.S. victim of terrorism. And when you compare that to cancer and influenza, heart disease, this stack would have to be 1,000 times higher to be in scale. You can see that this is not any sort of expenditure of making any sense. This is criminal fraud. Where did the war on terror come from? It didn't come from America. I'm going to talk now a little bit about the evolution of the Israeli stratagem. A stratagem is a trick, a device to fool people into doing something you want. The war on terror is an Israeli stratagem, a plot pushed by Netanyahu since 1979 to trick the U.S. into fighting a war against Israel's enemies. Bibi Netanyahu, right here, came back to Israel. He was working for the Rothschild company, Boston Consulting Group, in 76 to 78. And in 79, he went back to Israel, and with his father, Ben-Zion Milikovsky Netanyahu, born in Warsaw, they had something called the Jerusalem Conference on International Terrorism, which was arranged by Menachem Begin, the arch-terrorist, and George Herbert Walker Bush spoke at the third day. Bush, at the time, was a candidate for President of the United States, 1979, July. And ever since then, this Netanyahu has made a career out of pushing this idea that the United States should wage war against terrorists and all those bad guys. And he's written books, or put books together based on conferences, like the one he gave in 79, Terrorism, How the West Can Win, Fighting Terrorism. And the man who arranged the conference was this man here, Menachem Begin. And he was asked, when he created a political party called the Likud, he was asked by a British journalist, how does it feel in the light of all that's going on to be the father of terrorism in the Middle East? And Begin said, in the Middle East, he said, in all the world. So he put on himself that mantle of being the father of terrorism in all the world, without any shame. No, nothing to be shameful of. This is what he is. And it's true. And the party that he created in 1974 has been headed by this man, Netanyahu, since 1993. And this party, the terrorist party, it's a party of terrorists, has been in power since 1977, basically without any stop in Israel. There's been a few coalition governments here and there, but they've basically been running the country since 1977. Now, when you have a country run by a bunch of terrorists, what do you expect from it? Here is what Menachem Begin did in 1946. He blew up the King David Hotel along with the Haganah. A crime very similar to 9/11 in its motivation. It was the destruction of the. This was British HQ headquarters in Palestine when the British were running the place after World War I. Here's Menachem Begin, the arch-terrorist. He was born in Russia, came to Palestine in 1942, headed the Irgun, the group that blew up the hotel, the terror group. He bombed the King David Hotel in 1946, committed the Deir Yassin massacre in 1948, created Likud in 1973, became prime minister in 1977, and promptly invaded Lebanon. Nice guy. Now, I put this in here to show you that American Jews understood, some American Jews understood the dangers that Begin represented when he came to power in the 40s. When Begin came to visit this country in December 1948, Albert Einstein, along with 26 other prominent Jews, wrote a letter to the New York Times. And I want to read some of this bit of this letter because they understood the danger, what it represented. They said the discrepancies between the bold claims being made by Begin and his party and their record of past performance in Palestine bear the imprint of no ordinary political party. This is the unmistakable stamp of a fascist party for whom terrorism and misrepresentation, read deception, are means, and a leader state is the goal. In the light of the foregoing considerations, it is imperative that the truth about Mr. Begin and his movement be made known in this country, the United States of America. It is all the more tragic that the top leadership of American Zionism has refused to campaign against Begin's efforts or even to expose to its own constituents the dangers to Israel from support to Begin. And unfortunately, Albert Einstein's warning about this terrorist party went unheeded. He said, the public avowals of Begin's party are no guide whatsoever to its actual character. Today they speak of freedom, democracy, and anti-imperialism, whereas until recently they openly preached the doctrine of the fascist state. It is in its actions that the terrorist party betrays its real character. From its past actions, we can judge what may be expected to do in the future. Bingo. A political party that blows up hotels and kills people is likely to blow up buildings in the future. 9/11, same party, same people. Now, what happened in Palestine is that the United Nations partitioned it in 1947. This is the beginning of a war between the Arabs and the Jews. The Arabs that were led, the Israelis were led by these gangster parties of terrorists like the Irgun, which sought to build a bigger state than Israel is today. It's called Eretz Israel. And Menachem Begin was the head of this group, and this was their symbol. This was their emblem. So they aspire to a much larger state than Israel is today. They want a bigger state. And the way they do it is with the gun. And what happened is that this party, the Irgun, was the creation of Vladimir Jabotinsky, a hard right-wing Zionist born in Odessa, who said that they should have to build a concrete wall, or they had to build an iron wall between the Palestinians and the Israelis. That wall was built after 9/11. That's now reality. And that party that Mr. Jabotinsky founded, when Jabotinsky died in New York City in 1940, was taken over by Mr. Netanyahu's father. So you see, this is all the same group of people that have been part of this operation going back to the 40s. And they aspire to this idea of Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, basically stretching from the Euphrates River to the Nile. And this is from an Israeli website, what Israel's future borders will look like. Menachem Begin was against the partition plan of Israel. He said that all of this will be restored to the people of Israel forever. And that is today still the policy of the Likud party. They intend to increase the size of Israel to its maximum biblical proportions as they see. So Begin came to power in 1977. Here he is with his two henchmen or colleagues, Yitzhak Shamir over here and Ariel Sharon. All terrorists, all mass murderers, all genocidaires. Yitzhak Shamir, for example, was involved in the murder of this man, the United Nations envoy, the Swedish Count, Folke Bernadotte, who was murdered in an act of murder very much like Bonnie and Clyde style, machine gunned in the back of his car. And the gang that this guy headed, Yitzhak Shamir headed, was called the Stern Gang. And another man who belonged to the Stern Gang was this man's father. Do you recognize who this guy is? This is Rahm Emanuel. He's the mayor of the city of Chicago, my hometown. He was the senior advisor to Bill Clinton and chief of staff for Barack Obama, which goes to show there's no term limits on the Mossad man in the White House. Now, I think it's probably Jared Kushner and some of those other people along with Jared Kushner. So this is the way that they always have their guy at the highest level in the White House to make sure that the White House does what they want. And they know exactly what the White House is going to do at any given time. Here are some masterminds of Israeli terrorism in 1954. Shimon Peres, Pinchas Lavon, Moshe Dayan. And they had just been busted about a month earlier, doesn't seem like it's bothering them, putting nitroglycerin bombs in American embassy buildings in Egypt. In the libraries, American libraries and theaters and British libraries, they put these nitroglycerin bombs in there with the intention of having it blamed on the Muslim Brotherhood and putting a wedge between the United States and Britain and Egypt. And the prime minister at the time, Moshe Sharett, he was sorry to find out that he knew nothing about this. He was very much offended by Shimon Peres. He couldn't stand Shimon Peres. He said Peres was a danger to Israel. He said Peres shares the same ideology as Lavon, Pinchas Lavon. He wants to frighten the West into supporting Israel's aims. And this is exactly where we are today. All of this fear, all of this trepidation and fear that people feel from terrorism is being imposed on us with a narrative with the hope that we will then support the solution. And the solution will always be something that benefits the state of Israel, like a war against its enemies or taking away the guns or whatever the plan is. In terrorism, they have been successful in getting the United States to wage war against these countries, Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan. This is a David Dees drawing or illustration. And here you see Syria is in the eyes of this monster they call Zionism. And Zionism is, of course, it's an ideology, a Jewish nationalist ideology of a Zionist state, and the Zionist state is very much a product of the Rothschild family. So that's how those things fit together. And the United States Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1948, before Israel became a state, they did 13 papers on what the new state of Israel coming down the tubes would mean to the United States of America. And they said, Zionist strategy will seek to involve the United States in a continuously widening and deepening series of operations intended to secure maximum Jewish objectives. And what were those maximum Jewish objectives? The paper went on to say, the expansion of Eretz Israel, that's the land of Israel, into Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, and the establishment of Jewish military and economic hegemony over the entire Middle East, basically making Israel the imperial power in the Middle East. And this is exactly what we're doing. We've destroyed Libya, we've destroyed Iraq. Iraq was the most advanced technological Arab state. Libya was the most wealthy and prosperous state in northern Africa. Afghanistan is the poorest country in Asia. And Syria, these are secular states. These two were both very big secular states. And both were foes against Israel. Now they've both been destroyed. And destroyed on a biblical level. As they talk about in the Bible, where everything is destroyed just to the ground. Well, this is the first Prime Minister of Israel. He was an employee of the Rothschilds. And he said in 1948, just days after Israel became a state, he said, we should prepare to go over on the offensive with the aim of smashing Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. So you see, this was not something that they just dreamed up in 1982. This has been the plan all along. And in 1967, the Israelis attacked an American spy vessel off the coast of Egypt. This USS Liberty. And the Israelis attacked it knowing full well it was an American ship, with the intention of sinking the ship and putting it to the bottom with all lives lost. That was what the order was that came to Tel Aviv to the pilots. Sink the ship, no survivors. And this is Hillary Clinton in 2012. She was Secretary of State, and this is one of those leaked emails. She said in the email, the best way to help Israel is to use force to overthrow the government of Syria. And that's what the United States began doing in 2012, spending $1 billion a year through the CIA to pay these mercenaries to overthrow the government of Syria. There's no American interest in doing that. So 22 years after it was born in Jerusalem in 1979, the Israeli stratagem known as the War on Terror became operational. The purpose of 9/11 was to start the Zionist war agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Israeli connections to 9/11. First of all, ideation. In 1978, the Israeli agent Arnon Milchan made his first movie called The Medusa Touch, in which a Boeing 747 flew into the Pan Am building in New York. And the same year he made the film, here he is talking to Ezra Weizmann, the Israeli defense minister, in 1978. He's Israel's highest nuclear smuggling agent. He's #1 in this category. And he makes movies as a cover for his spying. Here's his first film. They're making this movie about the 747 going into the building. This is him more recently. This is with his good friends Shimon Peres, who's now passed away, and Bibi Netanyahu. When this man, Arnon Milchan, was caught smuggling nuclear triggers to Israel, all of his employees were indicted, but he wasn't indicted. And Netanyahu worked for him at the time. He smuggled 850 nuclear triggers to Israel. The United States went back to Israel and said, can we have our triggers back, please? Israel gave half of them back. Then he made this film, along with Rupert Murdoch, in the year 2000, in which a Boeing passenger aircraft is remotely hijacked and flown into the World Trade Center. This is the World Trade Center. And it was shown on TV in a program called The Lone Gunman. Note the plural down there, gunman, in the pilot episode, which was called Pilot. It's only 20 minutes long. But it shows this idea, this obsession with flying planes into buildings. Then in 1979, the head of the Mossad, head of the Israeli intelligence, founding father, predicted that Arabs would attack the tallest buildings in New York City. He made the prediction to this American Jew from Texas. His name is Michael Evans. He runs something called the Jerusalem Prayer Club, and he's a Jewish guy, but he has a Texas evangelical church which serves Zionism. The whole purpose is to serve Zionism. Here he is, buddy-buddy with Menachem Begin. So the prediction went like this. You know, he was having dinner with the head of the Mossad. Not everybody has dinner with the head of the Mossad, but he was. And he said, do you think terrorism will come to America? And if so, where and why? And Issa Harel said, I fear it will come to you in America. America has the power but not the will to fight terrorism. Asked about where it would happen, Issa Harel said, New York City is a symbol of freedom and capitalism. It's likely they will strike the entire Empire State Building, your tallest building, and a symbol of your power. He made this prediction in 1979, 22 years before 9/11 happened. Uncanny. Then, Issa Harel sent 2 of his top lieutenants to the United States to get the security contract for the World Trade Center. And this is the man who was the president of the company, Atwell Security of Tel Aviv, who got the security contract for the World Trade Center. But when it was discovered by the Port Authority that he was using a fake name and that he'd been convicted of murder back in Israel as head of the Shin Bet, they tore up the contract. But had they not torn up that contract with Atwell Security of Tel Aviv, 9/11 probably would have happened in the 1980s, late 1980s or maybe 1990s. And we would have been at a terrible disadvantage because we didn't have internet or anything of that sort. So we would have just been reading about it in Time magazine or, New York Times. Oh, these two characters were also involved in previous big operations like kidnapping Adolf Eichmann in Argentina and stealing plutonium, smuggling plutonium from the United States of America from Pennsylvania, bringing it to Israel for nuclear bombs. So these were not, small fry. These were senior agents. Well, when they were rejected, when they were turned away by the Port Authority, they didn't quit and go away. They went to work for American Jews, Jules Kroll here and Maurice Greenberg. These two are business partners. Jules Kroll's company, called Kroll Associates, got the security contract for the World Trade Center after the first bombing in 1993. And at that point, that Israeli guy I showed you, Abraham Shalom Ben Dor, was working for Jules Kroll. So using the American Jew like a Trojan horse, they got what they wanted. Now, if you're going to have a war on terror, you have to have a good enemy. You got to create the enemy if it's not there. So they created one called Hezb Islami, the Gang of Gulbuddin. And this photograph shows these girls in Afghanistan now, in a current photograph, protesting against this Gang of Gulbuddin. This image is Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. And this guy's gang was created by and funded by the CIA, Saudi Arabia, and trained by Israeli intelligence. This is how it worked. In 1983 it began, when this man, Ehud Barak, was the head of Israeli military intelligence. And that's when they started arming and training these guys in skills of terrorism in Pakistan. These guys, like these Afghan Arabs, had come to join the jihad against the Red Army, the Soviet Union. This is the guy that masterminded the whole thing, Charlie Wilson from Texas. And he came to the Congress in 1973, and he was very pro-Zionist. And he's the one who arranged for the Israeli weapons and trainers to go to Pakistan to train the Gulbuddin Hekmatyar faction. And here he is shaking hands with Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. But the big question is, here's Gulbuddin. The question is, why would the CIA and Israeli military intelligence, why would they arm and train the most anti-Western of all the mujahideen? It doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? The reason they were doing that is because they were creating the enemy for the war, for the future war. So they were creating the cadre, the group, that would then be the enemy in the future. And this is how it worked. Of course, it was done with the Mossad. Here's Charlie Wilson, and this is Zvi Rafia. And if you read the book Charlie Wilson's War, written in 2003, you'll see that Rafia always acted as if he owned Wilson's office. One of the staffers kept a list of people he needed to lobby. He would use the phones, he would give projects to the staff, and call on Charlie to intervene whenever he needed him. So here you have the station chief of Mossad in Washington, D.C., using a congressman's office as if it were his own. Quite unusual, quite audacious. And here's the Hebrew-speaking double agent, Ali Muhammad, who was the trainer of Osama bin Laden. This man trained Osama bin Laden from the very beginning. He also was essential in setting up this group of people who bombed the World Trade Center in 1993. He's also the guy that set up the cell in Nairobi that blew up the American embassies. So finally the Americans caught up with him, although he was trained in Fort Bragg and other places like that in the United States. When the Americans finally caught up with him, the U.S., they put him on trial and they sent him to a federal penitentiary for a long time, from which he promptly disappeared without a trace. He disappears from a U.S. penitentiary, never to be seen again. And he's Hebrew-speaking double agent. I can tell you that there is nowhere in Egypt that you learn Hebrew, except the Israeli army. So then in 1994, Gulbuddin's gang became Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, after they were disowned by Iraq and by Saudi and Pakistani. They lost the support from Pakistan, they lost the support from Saudi Arabia, and so they became Al-Qaeda. And the rest is history. And in 1993, the first bombing in the World Trade Center occurred, and that was prosecuted by the very same guy who was supposed to prosecute and investigate 9/11, named Michael Chertoff. And Michael Chertoff prosecuted this crime, in which it was an FBI sting operation, where the FBI actually was the entity that created the bomb that went off. And how it worked, 6 people were killed. It wasn't meant to bring down the building. They knew it wasn't going to bring down the building. It was meant to impress on the American people the idea that Arabs were trying to bring down the building. And they had a sting operation, an elaborate sting operation set up, was run by this informant, this guy here, an Egyptian colonel named Ahmad Salem. And he brought into his circle these people like this blind cleric, blind sheikh, in order that then the prosecution would then send them to jail, and he was paid $1 million for his testimony and disappeared into the witness protection program, never to be seen again. So that's justice with the FBI and terrorism. Then the Zionists then called for a new Pearl Harbor. They called for it. For example, this document is from Foreign Affairs magazine. It's called Catastrophic Terrorism, and it's the report of a study group about catastrophic terrorism that was headed by Philip Zelikow. Philip Zelikow here, he's the guy who wrote the report on the World Trade Center, the 9/11 Commission report, along with John Deutsch and Ashton Carter, in which they were imagining the transforming event that could happen next month, that would change America, and it certainly has. His two co-authors on the report, Ashton Carter and John Deutsch, at the time were both partners with a company called Global Technology Partners, which is an exclusive affiliate of Rothschild North America. The whole purpose of this is to, invest Rothschild money in and get involved in the gravy train known as defense spending in this country, where all the money goes, right? Where all our money goes. Another group that talked about, changing American policy and was the PNAC, or Project for a New American Century. And it started by these people, William Crystal and the Kagan family, the Kagan family, Father Donald, Robert Fred, and Robert's wife, Victoria Nuland. Victoria Nuland is important because she's the woman who brought us the war in Ukraine, or the situation in Ukraine, which has brought the United States and Russia into conflict. And they wrote this document in the year 2000, September, 1 year before 9/11, in which they said that American military policy in the world has to change. America has to become the global police force, basically, and dominate the entire planet. And they said the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. So you can see that these Zionists had these dreams of changing American policy on a radical, radical scale. But they knew they couldn't do it without some shock and awe on the American people. And that shock and awe was 9/11, of course. That's what brought them what they wanted. And then we have on 9/11 the security at the U.S. airports in Boston and Dulles and Newark, what have you. Passenger screening and airport security was provided by the Israelis. These men in particular, they owned the company that oversaw passenger screening. And the guy in the middle is the son of Yitzhak Shamir. That's Yair Shamir right here. That's Yitzhak Shamir's son, and Boaz Harel and Kuckerman. So they controlled a company. They had a company called Huntley USA from St. Louis, which oversaw all of the passenger screening. So that company, their company, was in the docket, was being held accountable in the tort litigation to explain how the bad guys got on the planes. But the judge let the company go home, so it never went anywhere. So these are the 19 guys. We're told these guys are on the plane, but there's actually no evidence that they're on the plane. None. Even the FBI head, Mueller, said in 2002, he says, there is no legal proof of who the hijackers are, or if there were hijackings even. So it's all a story. We're led to believe that it's true, but there's no evidence to back it up. Well, these guys, 15 of these 19 hijackers lived in Florida, and 6 of them had been issued duplicate licenses in a very systematic way. What happened is a guy would go in on like Tuesday and get a license. Then the next day, on Wednesday, somebody would call up, say, I'm Muhammad Atta, I moved to a new apartment yesterday, I need a new license with my new address. Can you do that for me? And DMV in Florida said, yeah, sure, we'll send it to you. Just destroy the old license, okay? And that's what happened. But if you read it in the Florida newspapers, you'll see that it was just like that, the next day. So this is somebody is actually stealing the person's identity. And this is an old Israeli Mossad trick. Other one of these people had reported lost passports, which means that their passports out there being used by somebody else. And then, of course, 7 of these guys were reported to be quite alive and fit after 9/11. So the whole idea that these guys were hijackers is really pretty preposterous. Now, the idea of using fake documents to leave a false history is an old Israeli method, and you can read about it in this book, The Little Drummer Girl. in which the Mossad guy says, terror is theater. Theater is a contrick. Do you know what that means? Contrick, you've been deceived. And the whole essence of this story, The Little Drummer Girl, it was written by John le Carré with the help of Israeli military intelligence, is how they lay a trail for a Palestinian, and then commit a crime, like a bombing in a synagogue in Germany, and then the next day, the Palestinian is blown up in a car on the Autobahn, and case closed. Palestinian bombed the synagogue, now he's dead, it's all over. This is exactly what we're seeing every single day with these various terrorist attacks, whether they're in Pakistan or Afghanistan or Iraq or in San Bernardino or Orlando. It's all the same. And the problem we have today in this country is that the FBI is more involved in carrying out acts of terrorism than it is in solving them. That's a real problem. And then in July of 2001, the Zionists got the lease for the World Trade Center. That's important because when they're going to do a big thing like 9/11, they have to own the venue. Like when Bobby Kennedy was killed down in the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, the hotel was owned by the people who carried out the crime. How did they privatize the World Trade Center? Because the World Trade Center was actually public property. It was owned by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, which is a state agency. So they had to privatize it. So they set up a privatization board, which was headed by this guy, Ronald Lauder, the son of Estee Lauder. Now he then suggested that they privatize the World Trade Center. Now look at Lauder's his history. Lauder funds the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy and Strategy at the Mossad Center, IDC, in Herzliya, Israel, where the Israeli Major General Daniel Rothschild heads Institute for Policy and Strategy. That's Danny Rothschild there. So back in Israel, these two guys are running the same operation. So that's probably where he got the command or the order, privatize the World Trade Center. Because then it went to the head of the Port Authority, who was Lou Eisenberg, who then oversaw the negotiations that delivered it to this guy, Larry Silverstein. Now again, there's a Zionist connection. Silverstein and Eisenberg, these two men, are both on the board of the UJA Federation of New York. So they have this back channel, fraternity that you don't know about, but that's key to making the decisions that they make. And then, between Silverstein and Netanyahu, there's this, every Sunday afternoon they would speak on the telephone. This is from an Israeli newspaper in 2001. Said for years, Netanyahu and Silverstein kept in close touch. Every Sunday afternoon, New York time, Netanyahu would call Silverstein. It made no difference where Netanyahu was, he would always call. Now this continued after Netanyahu became prime minister in 1996. So you can see that this went on for the better part of a decade. Every Sunday afternoon. My God, what were they talking about? What was so important that they had to have a conversation every Sunday afternoon? And this is the mastermind of the war on terror. This is the man who got $4.5 billion over the destruction of the World Trade Center. None of his money was involved, really. This is when he got the property, and of course, with a longer time, I could explain a lot of this inconsistencies in this, but he got the keys to the front door when he had no money, really. He didn't have nearly any money to run the World Trade Center. What was the first thing he did? He insured it for an act of terrorism, which has never happened before in the history of the United States, or in insurance. And he jacked the rates, he increased the rates of the rent 40%. Would a person who was interested in making money on rent raise rent 40%? No. He's doing that because he was insuring his future rent for the next 99 years. So he insured his income from rent. So by increasing the rent drastically, he was going to get more money in the end, he saw. He knew the World Trade Center would not be there 6 weeks later. And it wasn't. This is all that was left. And the guys that removed the rubble and destroyed the rubble said all that was left was dust and steel. Now the steel remained in sight, or a few hundred meters away from the center of the buildings, and the dust went all through Manhattan. And then on September 11th, before the buildings even fell, the senior Israeli military chief, Ehud Barak, the same guy who had trained Osama bin Laden, interpreted 9/11 for us. He said, The world will never be the same from now on, in a very thick Israeli accent. He said, we know who's behind this. It's Osama bin Laden, and we know where he is. He said, now it's time to launch an operational, concrete war against terrorism. And look where he's saying this. He's saying this in the London studio of the BBC World, the largest English-speaking television broadcast in the world. And he just happens to be in the studio at 9/11, ready to talk. Amazing. And the towers haven't even fallen yet. Now, what's the relationship between that guy, Ehud Barak, and Netanyahu? Well, Barak was his commander in the Sayeret Matkal, a covert independent commando force that serves under Israeli military intelligence. The same guys who trained Osama bin Laden. Then the weird thing was that the Deputy Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Olmert, this guy here, was in New York City on September 10th and 11th. I discovered, how can you say I discovered it? I read it in the sports page of the Jerusalem Post. It was reported in the sports page of Jerusalem Post years later that he had overseen the transaction in New York City, but in which he had sold the football club of the Likud, the Beitar football club. He sold it to these American Jews, Israeli Jews in America. And so, well, he was there, and then the night before I checked, and the night before, and the 9th, he was up in Ottawa or Toronto at some fundraiser, Jewish Federation fundraiser. So, well, where was he on the 11th? Well, on the 11th, one LL passenger 747 was allowed to leave from JFK. When all the planes in the United States were grounded, they were allowed to fly to Israel under the orders of the Department of Defense. Now, what's weird about this is that this guy was Deputy Prime Minister of the State of Israel and the mayor of Jerusalem, which is the sister city of New York City. Usually, his visit would be on the front page of the newspapers in New York, but this time it was absolutely silence. Why? He just got out of jail. He's been in jail for about 2 years in Israel for some bribery, some nonsense there. Nothing 9/11 related. And then about 10 days after he left on the 11th, about 10 days later he came back and acted like he'd never been there before. And he never mentioned, like, I was just here on the 10th or the 11th, nothing like that. And then he appeared next to Giuliani, being his guide and his big brother in terrorism, and saying, you know, talking about how Israel knows all about this kind of stuff. Yeah, we did it. They know all about it. But the thing is, his visit to the United States was kept secret. When the government knew, FBI knew, the mayor of New York knew, they all knew he was there. But they all play this game that he wasn't there. Why? Then there were these 5 dancing Israelis. There were many more than 5, but these are the 5 that were caught in New Jersey. The first 2 over here, sitting in the audience, are the brothers Kurtzberg. They're known agents of the Mossad. So when they were arrested by the New Jersey police put their names in and said, okay, these are Mossad guys. These 3 were just helpers. So these 3 appeared on TV in Israel after they were sent back to Israel. And these people had been observed photographing and celebrating the attack on the World Trade Center from just across the Hudson River. And they had been like taking video, high-fiving, and with the buildings burning in the background, they've been like clicking lighters like people do at football games, you know, soccer games, clicking lighters at concerts. Wow, this is really great. High-fiving. They were happy. And this woman saw it from her apartment. She said it was weird. These people were like cheering and happy. They were celebrating. So on September 11th, the FBI was looking for 5 Middle Eastern men as I was driving across Pennsylvania, going back to Chicago. And I told my wife, they could be Israeli. And it turned out they were. The only paper that reported was a New Jersey paper called the Bergen Record, and a journalist called Paulo Lima. I contacted Paulo Lima, talked to him about this and everything like that. But the story never went any further than New Jersey. It didn't go across the river to New York. Why not? Wait, Ted Koppel was talking about this just yesterday. Why is it not interesting? Because they were Israelis. So this is one of the key aspects of 9/11. And I called the Israeli embassy like a week later, and I said, well, they arrested 5 here, and 6 here, and 4 here, and 10. I said, my calculation must be at least like 50 or 60 of these Israelis have been busted for 9/11. And she said, the Israeli embassy said, at least. So there were a lot of Israelis who had been arrested in conjunction with driving cars with bombs and pictures of cars and planes flying into buildings, and one van exploded in the middle of New York, all this kind of stuff. But they all went home on visa violations. Slap on the wrist, Because they were agents. And our government was complicit in the cover-up. But who was running our investigation at the time? Michael Chertoff, an Israeli Mossad agent. So this is what they said when they got back to Israel. These guys, this is one of them. He says, our purpose was to document the event. And then the Jerusalem Post reported on September 12th, reported that the foreign ministry had received the names of 4,000 Israelis who were thought to have been in the area of the World Trade Center or the Pentagon at the time of the attack. And what happened, though, is that only 3 died at the World Trade Center, which meant that a lot of people were advised not to go to work that day or not to go to the World Trade Center or the Pentagon. And that we now know, we've known from since 9/11, that there's an Israeli instant messaging platform called Odigo that was used to send out warning messages to Israelis who were members of this platform, who were, subscribers to this service. And the message was accurate to the minute and had been sent out several hours before. We found out about it because 2 of the workers in Israel reported to their superiors that they had gotten this message warning of an attack at the World Trade Center. And the FBI went over there and did a little investigation. We never heard anything about it. But the vice president of the company said that the warning had been precise to the minute, meaning 8:45 in the morning. All hell's going to break loose at World Trade Center. You don't want to go there today. Go someplace else. And then there's this subject of these put options. These are these United Airlines and American Airlines stock options. We're betting that the price would go down on 9/11. And so when tragedy struck and the stock prices went down, this investor made a lot of money. And we know that the 9/11 Commission report wrote about this company that made this investment. It said, a single U.S.-based investor, institutional investor, with no conceivable ties to Al-Qaeda, purchased 95% of the put options on United Airlines on September 6th and bought 115,000 shares of American on September 10th, the same way. And then we found out who that company was later. That company was the former company of Buzzy Krongard, who was the executive director of the CIA on 9/11. This man right here. Don't let his last name fool you. He's not Danish. And he's a Polish-Jewish guy, and the family came to America and gave themselves this Danish name. But to the embarrassment of investigators, it has emerged that the firm used to buy many of the put options was headed until 1998 by Buzzy Krongard. And this is his estate in Maryland, and this is his wife. And he had been, until 1997, the chairman of Alex Brown, an investment banking firm with ties to Israeli military intelligence, and again, Yair Shamir, company Cytex. So the company that bought the options was a company that he headed with ties to Israeli military intelligence. And his wife, here's Alvin Krongard here. Here's his wife, Cheryl, and she works for Rothschild Asset Management. So again, you always find the Rothschild connection there. One step back, one removed from the crime, but always there. Then there's Israeli guy, this Israeli-American guy, dual national, named Michael Chertoff. He was the person who did not investigate 9/11, who was supposed to investigate 9/11. But as I said, they called it an act of war, so they went ahead, instead of investigating the crime, they simply confiscated the evidence and destroyed it. And he's the person who should have investigated 9/11. John Ashcroft was the Attorney General. That's the Assistant Attorney General, Chertoff. And Chertoff was given the dossier for the investigation. And for day-to-day decisions, Chertoff had the last word. And after he served as Attorney General, Assistant Attorney General, he was made Homeland Security Czar in 2005. And in this position, he remained in charge of all the evidence of 9/11. So for the better part of a decade, this one Israeli son of the Mossad, his mother was a Mossad agent, one of the first Mossad agents, he was in charge of all the evidence, access to all the evidence of 9/11. And then the Zionists destroyed the key evidence, the steel. All we had left was all the steel. The steel had to be destroyed because the steel had telltale marks that would indicate explosions and thermite had been used. And then the Zionists presided over the 9/11 lawsuits and litigation. This is the judge who oversaw it, Alvin K. Hellerstein. Problem here is that the judge is in New York in the courtroom where he's overseeing the tort litigation for 9/11, The key defendant is an Israeli company, ICTS, that controlled passenger screening. His son in Israel works for ICTS. This is his son Joseph. This is his father. And Joseph worked for a law firm that is working for the Rothschild Group and the parent company of ICTS. Fundamental primary family conflict of interest is not kosher. Nobody in New York seemed to care. And then the way that they handled all the victims, there were 3,000 wrongful death cases, is these high-level Zionists, Kenneth Feinberg, he oversaw the special compensation, he was special master of the compensation, whereby the first 2,900 families were given money. Basically, they were bought off. They were given this money, go home, no future litigation, non-disclosure. Then there were 96 families left who held out for a court case. They wanted to know who was responsible for the loss of their loved one. They went into the 9/11 tort litigation in Alvin K. Hellerstein's courtroom, where the son worked for the ICTS. And the special mediator was this woman here, Sheila Birnbaum, and she oversaw the war of attrition in which every one of those families was settled out of court. While she was settling the families, the judge was cutting away the case until there was nothing left of the case. So ultimately, the last families, there was nothing for them to go to court for. The case had been so cut away, there was nothing left. It was like a burger with nothing left. He had thrown out the Israeli defendant. He had reduced the case to nothing, meaninglessness. And again, here, Skadden Arps, she works for Skadden Arps, which is a law firm with very close ties to Israel. This is the judge. This is Mukasey. This is a partner of Hellerstein. They go to the same Zionist synagogue in New York. This guy oversaw the 1993 prosecution for the bombing in New York City in the World Trade Center. And he oversaw Silverstein's battle with the insurance companies, where Silverstein was asking for a double indemnity, and he got it. He got $4.5 billion. And then Bibi Netanyahu admitted that Israel has benefited from 9/11. On 9/11, he said, it's very good. It'll generate immediate sympathy. And then a few years later, he said, we are benefiting. We, in Hebrew, he said, we are benefiting from one thing, Israelis, and that is the attack on the Twin Towers and Pentagon and the American struggle in Iraq. One thing, Twin Towers, Pentagon, and American struggle in Iraq, these are three disconnected things, but in his mind, they're all the same. I point out again that he is the chairman of the Likud since 1993. The Likud is the terrorist party that Albert Einstein warned us about. And then the Zionists controlled the 9/11 myth. Zelikow, for example, completed the 9/11 Commission report before the staff even began working. This man had studied, I think, at Rice University. He'd gotten his master's or his PhD, and his specialty was, his thesis was on the creation and maintenance of the public myth. And the guys that wrote this myth, the guys who worked on it, they said they couldn't believe it. These are honest Americans. They said, this is John Farmer said, what government and military officials told Congress, the commission, the media, and the public about who knew what when was almost entirely and inexplicably untrue. The commissioners, Thomas Keane, said, to this day we don't know why NORAD told us what they told us. It was just so far from the truth. NORAD being the air defense system between the United States and Canada that failed to intercept any planes on 9/11. Go figure. These planes, even these little planes that are flying out here go faster than these passenger planes. And the Israelis then constructed the memorial and have written the legacy. This guy, his name is Michael Arad. The World Trade Center was designed by him. He's the son of Moshe Arad, the former Israeli ambassador to the United States of America. So every aspect of this whole saga has been created, written, and maintained by Israelis in the United States of America. I mean, are we unable to build our own memorials? Are we unable to investigate our own crimes? Are we unable to, intercept planes? Everything failed on 9/11, and the Israelis are written all over it. Mayor Bloomberg and Israeli leader Netanyahu discussed the Israeli names at the 9/11 memorial, all four of them. And the media has completely dropped the ball, but the media that we're talking about is Zionist media. In this case, it's the New York Times, owned by the Sulzberger Ox family, the founding family of Lodge Number 1 of B'nai B'rith in New York City. And their lead editorial, three years after 9/11 on the day, they said, in the 3 years since 9/11, we've begun to understand that it's possible to know what happened without knowing what happened. End of story. That's all you're going to get. They say, some of what we need to know publicly has been provided by the report of the 9/11 Commission. Other answers are lacking. So for 15 years, the controlled media has pushed a false narrative about 9/11 and the war on terror, all the while suppressing real evidence that disproves the official myth. Why the war on terror will never end? Well, thank you very much. So the evidential trail for 9/11, this is written by Alan Sabrowski, who wrote the foreword for my book, the little book there on the war on terror. He said the evidential trail for 9/11 and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq runs from PNAC, AIPAC, and their cohorts through the mostly Jewish neocons in the Bush administration and back to the Israeli government. None of the denials and political machinations can alter that essential reality. So that's the end of this little program. And what I tell people is that you need not worry yourselves sick about this, because things are not nearly as bad as they would have you believe they are. They operate on fear, like this Time magazine cover, the American Nightmare. The American Nightmare ends when you wake up and understand that it's all a deception. 9/11 is a deception. The war on terror is a deception. That's the good news. The bad news is that it's still going on. You've been undeceived, but what we have to do is we have to undeceive a lot more people. So 9/11 and the war on terror are both deceptions, and the only way to defeat deception is to increase awareness of the truth. So what we're dealing with here is we have to increase our awareness of the truth and then spread it to other people. And hopefully we can start a movement in this country and turn things around, because our country's been hijacked. So thank you very much. Can you turn the lights up a little bit, and we can have some questions if we have time? I think we have a little bit of time.
Okay.